I'll call to order this regularly scheduled meeting of the Community Development Committee for the Metropolitan Council. It's November 18th, 2024. I'm Councilmember Robert Lilligan, the chair of this committee, joined by a quorum of the committee. Before we move through the agenda, I'll just note I've had a request from committee members that we keep this meeting moving. So that's up to you guys, or that it's up to me. So we will move along. We have an agenda in front of us. Unless someone has a change or addition to the agenda, we'll consider it approved. The agenda is approved. We'll move on to approval of the November 4th, 2024 Community Development Committee minutes. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Thanks. Either Councilmember Wolf or Councilmember Lee. Take your pick, Michelle. Any discussion, additions, corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. And we'll move on to the consent agenda, the 5 items on the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve, please?
So moved.
Thank you. Thank you. Council members Vento and Johnson. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Those items are approved. We'll move on to our one non-consent business item. It's item 2024-310. It's the same week item. It's the West Mississippi River Trail Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund Award. This is an application from the Three Rivers Park District, and Jessica Lee is here to present. Welcome, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Chair and Council members. I'm Jessica Lee. I'm a planning analyst in parks. And I'm here to present business item 2024-310, same week, for the Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund for West Mississippi River Regional Trail, the Yancey property for Three Rivers Park District. And also Three Rivers Park District staff is here tonight to help out with questions if needed.
So not advancing. Greg, could you advance the slide, please, Greg? Did you do that, or did he?
I don't know.
Okay.
Thank you, maybe, Greg. All right, the West Mississippi River Regional Trail is located along the northeast border of Hennepin County, alongside the Mississippi River. It travels from Dayton through Champlin, Brooklyn Park, and Brooklyn Center. The regional trail is divided into 4 segments, as shown on the map on the left. Segments C and D are open to the public and total 10 miles. Segments A and B will add an additional 10 miles once completed. The map on the right shows segment A in greater detail, with the Yancey property location starred. It also shows the Elm Creek Park Reserve Trail connector that will connect the West Mississippi River Regional Trail to the Elm Creek Park Reserve. The Yancey property has mature tree coverage along the back half of the property and contains 670 feet of Mississippi River shoreline. It's also nearly adjacent to other public land, including Three Rivers property acquired for the regional trail, the local Gooden Park, and Gooden Island across the river. The property consists of 4 parcels. The 2 small parcels on the left have been used for agriculture, a third contains outbuildings, and the largest parcel contains 2 homes, as well as most of the river frontage. The homes and buildings will be removed from the property. One of the homes is newer, and Three Rivers is going to attempt to sell the home at a public auction. Any proceeds from the home will be used to help pay for stewardship costs that exceed their local match, and after that, proceeds will go back into Three Rivers Regional Park System. Three Rivers worked really hard to repurpose the home for affordable housing. They met with local governments and Habitat for Humanity, as well as Met Council housing and real estate staff. But ultimately, they were not able to find a location or organization for the home in the timeline required for this acquisition. The property currently does not have legal access, but Three Rivers is working with the seller to resolve this issue and will not acquire the property until there is legal access. And they expect to resolve this very soon, as the seller wants to close as soon as possible. So the appraised value of this property is $1,605,000, and the seller has agreed to a purchase price of $1.6 million. The total project cost is $1,906,666, and the grant amount is $1.28 million. The grant amount is not quite 75% of the total, as we normally do, because Three Rivers has reached their $1.7 million annual cap for legacy funds. Because of this, their match is $150,000 more than required. So if they're successful in selling the house, those proceeds can cover this extra cost. Our rationale for recommendation is that this acquisition is consistent with the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan, the Parks and Trails Legacy Fund, the West Mississippi River Regional Trail Long Range Plan, and Three Rivers Park District is within its $1.7 million per fiscal year limit for the Parks and Trails Legacy Fund, Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund. Our recommendations are that the Metropolitan Council approve a grant of up to $1.28 million from the Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund to Three Rivers Park District to acquire 4 parcels totaling 6.9 acres located at 15520 Lawndale Lane North in Dayton, Minnesota for the West Mississippi River Regional Trail. To authorize the Community Development Director to execute the grant agreement and restrictive covenant on behalf of the council. To require that Three Rivers Park District resolve access issues with the property owner before acquiring the property. And to require that if Three Rivers Park District is able to sell the newer home at a public auction, the proceeds must first be used to cover stewardship costs that exceed the required match. And any remaining proceeds must be used for the betterment of the Three Rivers Park District's share of the regional parks and trail system. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ms. Lee, for your report and for your work on this. Questions on this report from committee members? Any questions? Oh, excellent. Hearing none, motion has been suggested. Councilmember Johnson.
I would move to approve the staff recommendation as proposed in the report.
Great, thanks. And I notice this is in your district as well, so congratulations. Is there a second on that motion?
Second.
Thank you, Councilmember Lee. Any discussion on the motion? Discussion. Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you. And we'll move on to our 2 information items for this week, this cycle. The first is the Livable Communities Act program update. And our very helpful consultants, Ellen Waters and Mary Kay Bailey, are here to present, and Sarah Berkey's on hand as well. So thanks.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's a pleasure to be with you all this month. We've been here, this is our third and final, and we're excited to share with you the results of really the last 3.5 months of our analysis of the LCA program. I hope you have had a chance to review the report in advance. We're going to try to hit mostly highlights and leave plenty of time for discussion. So hopefully that works with you all. So as I said, we want to share some highlights. We want to have discussion and hear your reaction, and then talk a little bit about what comes next. So just to review our charge, you were asked back in the spring, and then over the course of the spring and summer, we were selected to do an analysis looking back at LCA, particularly over the last decade, and then begin to pivot to looking forward at how LCA will respond to new initiatives under Imagine 2050. A goal was to promote widespread participation of communities across the region. Most of our analysis has focused in that area, and that's for a couple of reasons. Understanding how LCA has been implemented has taken, and we're going to share a lot of analysis around enrollment and awards and applications and how that's played out. And then secondarily, the aligning with Imagine 2050 has, we laid the groundwork for that, but because you have not formally adopted Imagine 2050, some of that work needs to happen in 2025. So most of our attention has been paid to that first point around program participation and minimizing barriers to access. So we spent a lot of time talking about data that we'll share with you. We also did a lot of qualitative analysis of surveys and interviews and focus groups, and then of course talking to all of you. So we're going to review all of that very succinctly today. So let me tell you a little bit about how the report is organized. We start, and I'll shift in a moment to describing the realities. We thought it was important to give you a sense of how we saw the landscape, the situation, so we'll start with that. Today we'll focus on the newer analysis because we have, through the course of the last 3 months, shared with you pieces along the way. So we're not going to revisit all of that. We're also not going to share a lot of the potential changes, much of which we engaged you in discussion in last time, but they're all included in the report. And so we'll dive in now, starting with those realities. We wanted to we started when we got our assignment, we began by looking back at statute and kind of built from there. And so we thought that was an important grounding, that reminding ourselves that the impetus for LCA was to help communities meet regional goals. So that was a key piece, and it was is a voluntary tool. It's not a requirement, and it has also been amazingly successful. And there is routinely much more demand for funding than we have available resources. We've also found that the projects that tend to get funding through LCA, particularly LCDA, are those that are most closely aligned with council policy. And we want to emphasize that there is what doesn't get funded have been oftentimes terrific projects, but they haven't scored quite well enough because they aren't meeting the policy imperatives and the highest regional needs that have been defined by the council. They are still really good projects, but they haven't necessarily been able to break through because it's a really competitive program. And unfortunately, a lot of those projects have tended to be outside the urban core, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that. But that geographic tension is something that you all have expressed for years, but it's important to acknowledge it, that the distribution of LCA funds by geography is a tension, but it's not part of statute and it's not part of policy, except in a few instances where there has been a council decision to allocate funding with perhaps limits around where a concentration of awards can be made. That happens in LCDA. There's some in TBRA. There's some other things where the council has made that choice. So with that, those are a couple of the beginning realities. We'll remind ourselves that in the statute, it was very clear that said that statute would guide this along with the Regional Development Guide or the Metropolitan Development Guide. And so the last 10 years, much of LCA as it has been implemented has been guided by the Thrive policy. And it's also important to note, and we've shared this with you previously, that sometimes LCA has evolved. It's not a static set of programs. It has evolved to meet those changing policy priorities of the council. It has evolved to meet changing regional needs. And certainly it's been clear in recent years that prioritizing deeply affordable housing has been a council priority. Cities that submit applications that fit with that have tended to be those that receive funding. So what that means is that the council can choose to focus on geographic distribution, but that would be somewhat inconsistent with where policy is today and where it has been. In terms of that policy framework, we look at how the program has continued to respond to changing development patterns as well as policy, changing demographics, where we're seeing housing investment, for example, and where we see great regional needs. So this chart, which is included in the report, shows the significant gap on the far left between households needing housing that is at, the chart shows housing at different affordability levels. But on the far left, you see that deeply affordable, that 30%. And you see that it is the most needed in the region. So that's kind of an important reality. So those were some of the grounding facts. We also then wanted to bring in all of those perceptions, all the qualitative analysis that we did, including our interviews with 8 of the 9 of you serving on the Community Development Committee. We also looked and heard from city staff across the region. We paid particular attention to those staff from communities that have not been successful participants in LCA. There was information from developers, and there was a lot of agreement across all of those kind of key stakeholders around LCA is a good program. We appreciate staff. We think it's working fairly well. And then there's a whole bunch of areas of concern around how things get communicated, how it's implemented, but in general, a pretty high level of satisfaction. We also know a couple of key misperceptions, though, that kind of cross many of the stakeholder groups. The first is around how smaller and more suburban communities compete in LCDA in particular, compared to projects in the urban core. This misperception around projects in LCADA needing to have transit as part of it. Cities think of it that way, others think of it that way. It's not required in the LCDA regular program. And it is true that projects are, that scoring does consider context. Scoring does look at things like density. And it recognizes that density looks different in some more suburban communities than in the urban core. It does look at access and recognizes access looks different. So for example, an affordable housing project near an affordable daycare or grocery store in a suburban context would score well. Projects that wouldn't score well are projects in isolation that don't consider how people move through and to the site. So that was a big one, and that shows us that we need to be clear about how we communicate to all of our stakeholders around the role, what does access, what does connection mean? It isn't about transit. Secondly, another misconception is the capacity of smaller and more suburban communities. A lot of feeling from city staff is that it's a lot of work. It's a complex process, it's a complex application. And cities say, you know, we don't have much experience. Because we don't have a lot of development, we don't put forward a lot of applications, and that means when we do, it's kind of new to us. It's hard, it takes a lot of time. While true, it's also important to note that a big chunk of the application actually gets put together by the development team. Now, the city's certainly guiding it, and the city staff does need to be helpful. But again, that's an area where I think we need to do a better job communicating, and we have a lot of possible changes where just enhanced outreach, enhanced technical assistance, much of which is happening, but we can be clear about what the expectation is. And there's some other changes that could help just make it easier to potentially understand if your project's going to be successful or not before you end up putting a lot of time and effort into it. But those were kind of two big misperceptions that kind of crossed a lot of those stakeholder groups. So with that, we're going to turn now to some of the newer to you data analysis that has been completed since we last got together.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. Hi, everybody. I'm going to give you a little bit of a refresher on some of the data that we looked at earlier, but spend most of the time talking about some of the newer analysis we did in the final report. But as a refresher, back in September, we talked about enrollment, and we shared that over the program's 30-year history, that the average number of cities enrolled was 96. For each enrollment period that happens right after the census takes place, there have been drop-offs. It was a more substantial drop-off in 2021, but as we all know, communities had a lot on their plates post-COVID and post-civil unrest. And since then, there has been a rebound of enrollment, growing to 77 now, and staff is currently in conversation with 2 other cities who are looking to re-enroll into the program. But one of the new things that we looked at for this final report was the process by which communities become eligible to participate, to see if there were any changes in that process that might have happened during the 2020-21 period that would have made it either more difficult or less desirable to enroll. So you all might know this, but roughly speaking, each decade, the council establishes an allocation of affordable housing need for every community that is sewer connected. And it involves a forecasting model that includes a lot of factors around growth, land use and employment, and transportation. And every community that's expecting growth is allocated a share of the region's affordable housing need. So if communities want to participate in the LCA programs, they work with the council to negotiate a housing goal for the decade. Communities have to plan for the possibility of those units by ensuring that they've got sufficient densities for multifamily housing in their comp plans. But they're also not penalized if the units don't end up being built. So for this most recent enrollment period, we found that the council actually adjusted the affordable housing goals downward. In the previous decade, goals were set at 65 to 100% of need. So from 2010 to 2020, that was the practice. And in this most recent cycle, goals are set at 55 to 100% of need. So when we looked at it with this lens, it didn't seem to us that changes in determining the overall allocation of need were likely to have had an impact on whether or not a community decided to enroll. Whoops. The next area that we looked at and that we've discussed in the past was around application and awards. And as Ellen said, we primarily focused on that decade between 2014 and 2023 to capture both the Thrive policy environment and the recent re-enrollment period. So during that time period, 64 communities have applied to one of the LCA programs, and 71% of applications were successful. That was interesting to us because, you know, that 71% acceptance is higher than a lot of like state housing tax credit awards and most philanthropic processes, but it still means that more than a quarter of applications are not successful. If you look at Appendix C in the report, we did a detailed breakdown by county of the total number of applications, awards, success rates, and funding totals. And unsurprisingly, the core cities and Hennepin and Ramsey County have had the most awards in the past decade. And it's pretty clear that there are several factors that have influenced this outcome. There's been the largest amount of development occurring in those places, and in particular, development that's been aligned with council goals. So those goals of development that's connected, compact, and affordable, that's been happening primarily in those locations. Those locations have also submitted the most number of applications by orders of magnitude, often 10 times larger than other communities. Hennepin and Ramsey County have the largest number of cities that are participating in the program. And then we've talked before about how both core cities have a pre-screening process that helps to bring the most competitive projects forward. And then the last thing that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail is that when the TOD program launched in 2011, funding was, this is like the one place where there is a specific geographic target where funding goes to TOD eligible areas. And while those areas have expanded throughout the region over time, most tend to be in the core, given the fact that the transit system is a hub and spoke model. So one other thing I want to point out here is that while it is definitely true that the core cities have received the most awards, it's also true that a number of non-core cities have been successful as well. Minneapolis has a 74% success rate. St. Paul has a 76% success rate. The communities on the slide have had higher success rates. So Roseville, Maplewood, Carver County, Edina, Brooklyn Center, Hopkins, and Washington County. And so when those non-core cities submit projects that are aligned with the program goals, they tend to have greater success rates. So one last piece to note is that communities that tend to have less development activity, and especially development activity that's not aligned with council goals, also don't apply that frequently. Thanks. Okay, so continuing around application and awards, we did do a really deep dive into county level data, looking at awards, levy contributions, and then a lot of contextual data like population, poverty levels, and development activity. And I apologize for the small print. You should see the spreadsheet. It's a very long row. But the takeaway, which I've said already, is that Hennepin and Ramsey County are the largest recipients of all LCA program dollars. They have the largest number of cities participating, and they've submitted more applications by like nearly a 10 times amount. And if you're in the report and you look at some of the other context-setting data, you can see that Hennepin and Ramsey counties have the largest populations and are home to 70% of the region's population experiencing poverty. The two counties are also building more affordable housing than the other counties, which is a key consideration in project scoring. And ultimately, since the grants are for development projects, it makes sense that more applications are coming from these areas with more development activity, and especially that activity that's aligned with council goals. And the thing I will point out is that we recognize that there is a political layer to this work, and that there are definitely communities that might feel that they should be getting back some more of what they're putting in. But ultimately, that's not how the program was designed by the legislature or staff, but that is something that is within your purview to be considering. Okay, so now shifting to look at the demand for the program and some of the program outcomes. We wanted to highlight LCA's versatility. I think that's one of the main reasons that it's valued and popular. The different programs support a variety of activities along the development continuum. You start on the left from helping communities, usually the smaller ones, prepare for development. Then there are programs that provide pre-development support and site cleanup support that help to get projects off the ground. And then you've got a number of LCA programs that help to support the actual hard costs of project construction. As we shared last month, the requests for LCA program funding have exceeded the available amount by more than $144 million. $144 million. And for the most part, programs like LCDA development and TBRA have requests that have been significantly greater than the funding that's been available. And we've also shown that over this past decade, funds have been able to support projects that have added thousands of units of housing at various degrees of affordability, while also supporting the creation of new jobs. Okay, so one of the things we did in the report that we haven't talked in detail about is a deeper analysis of two specific council policies that are likely to have had an impact on the distribution of awards. So the first is the policy of prioritizing funding for deeply affordable units. This approach is consistent with the data that show that the region is already exceeding its 10-year goal for supplying housing at the 51 to 80% AMI band, and that the region is nearly on track to meet the 10-year goal for housing affordable at 31 to 50% AMI. And as Ellen mentioned, the tension here is happening because the deeply affordable housing being built is primarily occurring in the core cities and in the inner ring suburbs, despite its need throughout the region. So this becomes particularly challenging when at the city level, affordable housing might be needed at all income bands. There can be examples in the suburbs in particular where projects are creating affordable units, but at a level that isn't regionally needed. So when the region has already built its supply between 60 and 80% AMI, it might be a welcome addition in that community, but it's not addressing the overall regional need. So what that means is those projects end up not being competitive, and this is the fundamental tension between a regional goal and a local need or desire. So one of the ways that you all have tried to address some of this is with LCDA, there is an administrative policy that requires that if eligible applications from suburban communities request more than 60% of funds, then no more than 40% can go to the core cities. So in some cases, this has meant that projects with less affordability and without any, supportive services and other things that this council has suggested are important end up getting funded, while some of the projects in the core cities that are more aligned don't get funded. So that's just an example of some of the trade-offs that happen. The next area that we wanted to look at was the LCDA TOD program. So that was created back in 2011 using relinquished and repurposed funds. And unlike any of the other programs, it limits the eligible geography based on the location of the light rail, bus rapid transit, and high-frequency bus lines. Because most routes go to and through Minneapolis and St. Paul, most of the eligible TOD areas are in Hennepin and Ramsey counties, even as I mentioned earlier, those TOD areas have expanded further out into the region as more lines have come under construction and development. So we looked at all awards by county using the 1996 to 2010 timeframe, which was the pre-TOD era, and then the 2011 to 2023, which is after the TOD program came online. And we looked at some of the changes and found that, in that latter period, only Hennepin and Ramsey County grew in their number of successful applications. And again, this is not a detailed statistical analysis. So while it is likely the TOD program had an impact on those numbers, it's also possible that other factors had an effect. During this time frame, this was kind of peak development activity in the core cities, and there was a lot of applications, as I showed earlier, coming out of Hennepin and Ramsey counties. We looked at some of the data that Metro Transit publishes, and during that same time period, they found that 37% of the region's development was occurring along high-frequency transit, including 43% of all multifamily development and 42% of commercial development. So this was really a boom time for development happening along transit corridors. So the takeaway for us was that the TOD program was originally created to support more quality development along transit corridors, and it appears that during this time frame, the markets responded positively. And so it might be a time to reconsider how the TOD program shifts in the coming years to potentially respond to new challenges and different needs in the region. Okay, so I've got a couple more slides that are kind of our takeaways from all of this analysis. As we said in the beginning, LCA grants are competitive, voluntary, and they're designed to reward communities that are pursuing development that's consistent with council goals and policies. And ultimately, that is what the project or the program is doing. The programs are aligned around policies like TOD and deeply affordable housing, and those are the projects that end up being most competitive. Geographic distribution's not currently in policy as a priority, but it is clearly the greatest source of friction, and the council has worked to manage geographic distribution by some of those administrative practices, also by ensuring that There are per city limits on the amount of funding that can go to an individual city. TBRA has in statute limits about how much can go to Minneapolis and St. Paul. And the policy development and affordable homeownership programs are designed to attract more participation from suburban and smaller communities. So ultimately, it is within the committee's purview and authority to change the LCA programs to further increase geographic distribution, but this might create a disconnect between current policy and implementation. So to close out our insights and observations, we've just want to reiterate, it's a valuable program, it's popular, it's having impact, and that the biggest concerns are around projects not receiving funding, not the projects that are. Staff are designing the program so that it aligns with council policy, and that's the policy that's in the regional development guide, the system statements, the strategic plan, and those are the policies that have been guiding program development and scoring. And ultimately, you all have the authority to change the way the program's administration to try to encourage more geographic distribution, and that can create a disconnect between the current policy, and that's a trade-off that you all as policymakers need to discuss and provide clear guidance to staff so that they're able to implement the program accordingly. And we talk a little bit more about this in the report, but the committee's role is to really set the policy that guides program implementation, and staff is charged with operationalizing that direction. And as you all consider changes for 2025 and 2026, those discussions should really clarify the desired policy and program outcomes and illuminate any potential trade-offs with making some of those changes. So I'm going to turn it back to Ellen to wrap us up with what the next steps are.
So, there you have it. There was a kind of a what question, and when we tried to answer that, we all know we were talking about LCA. So what? We looked at what's happened with it, what the impact has been, what it's meant to different communities. And we get to this point, and you see in the report a host of changes, suggested a set of administrative changes, a set of changes to start with in 2025, and a set of changes to be considered for 2026 or beyond. And as we've now said about 5 times, your role as policymakers will impact the direction those changes take. Your job is to direct staff on the kinds of things that you want to see or that you don't want to see, and they will respond. So again, part of the reason that there isn't more potential changes in 2025 is that we're still dealing with the adoption, hopefully first quarter in 2025 of Imagine 2050. So there's things that shift a little bit in there, although not a lot, in terms of your current kind of those big buckets of priorities. You're still kind of interested in jobs and housing. You're not moving away from that, and the environment and so forth. But that's got to be brought in. So that's going to happen in 2025. In addition, some of the changes are kind of a big deal and would need and warrant, and you as stewards of public resources would want to ensure that you're consulting with all your constituents. You would want to take the time in 2025 to talk with cities. How do they see these potential changes that you may be interested in? You'd also want to have staff take the time to model and stress test the impact of those changes. Take a set of previous applicants and run them through the change and see what the impact would be, so that by the time you get to the point where that you are thinking you might want to make a change, you really understand what the intended and unintended consequences of that change would be. So that's the point we're at today. We do hope that this kind of is a reminder. Much of this, I imagine you all knew. You've been sitting at this table for a long time. But hopefully this report and this analysis kind of, the role of outside consultants like us is to bring sort of that fresh eye, that objective view. And so that's what we have tried to do. And now we turn it over to you to figure out your next steps, because they really do belong to you all as the Community Development Committee and the Met Council. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Thanks, Mary Kay, for your report, for your work on this. The report is excellent. I'm sure many of us have spent time with the whole report. So thank you. Discussion, committee members, Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the great work on this. My question might be a dumb question, but if the geographic distribution is a point of stress, but it's also not in statute, then my dumb question is, for the LCDA pot, the 40-60 split, where exactly does that come from? Did we just at one point said that was going to be the thing, and then, so does that mean can we go forward, just say instead of 40-60, it'll be 50-50?
Yeah.
Was it?
Ellen, Mary Kay, do you have a response, or?
We do have a
have a
response, and I think it's in the report, but it happened in 2005. And maybe somebody from the staff team remembers or was here. But it happened in 2005. It was kind of reflecting maybe it was something about the ratio of applications, but it was grounded in a desire to make sure that there was more competition for those funds, and the percentages were based on, there was a rationale. But yes, it was decided, it was a business item at a Community Development Committee meeting. Were you
And that
here?
was after a
No.
few years of the TOD program being in place, so.
No, it was before
that's
TOD.
Oh, it was
Before,
before
right.
TOD, that's
Yeah.
right, 2005,
Yeah.
not 2001. Yep.
So, yep, it was an administrative action.
Director Bras, do you have more? I'm looking out in the audience too, and no staff members are rushing up here.
Well, I would just add that, thank you, Mr. Chair, that the TBRA, as you know, that split when there was competition for funds is set in state statute.
Yes.
So there was a discussion, my understanding, this is before my time at the council, around modeling that for other programs. And so doing that in LCDA, given experience in TBRA.
Anyone else? Yeah, Councilmember Bento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Thank you both, Ellen and Mary Kay. I appreciate this. My only thought is, under the changes phased in 2025, the first bullet is to study and engage stakeholders in review of more substantial changes. My ask would be that this committee, and frankly, all of our colleagues on the council, also be involved in those meetings and engagement with stakeholders, particularly as it relates to the city and township and county levels. The more we can be a part of those conversations, the more we know about what's being said to whom and why and what the rationale is. And the more that we're not involved in those, frankly, the harder it is for us to be responsive council members. So that would be my ask if that's what we're going to do going forward in 2025. I will be real candid. I like being told that we have the authority to make policy changes, but it's hard. It's really hard. And it's hard because we come from very different directions on this. Prior to 2 years ago, I didn't realize how really difficult it is to be in those collar counties. I had several communities, a number of communities that were, and I realized the challenges they faced, not just with LCDA, but also with transportation issues and other issues. And now that I have a majority of vast majority, like except for a small parcel, being collar counties, it's been a real eye-opening experience. And I understand why they feel disconnected from the Met Council.
Thank you, Councilmember. For discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the report and everything. There are some things that I would like more information on, which I would assume would have to come from our staff because you guys are done. You're off the clock. But understanding on slide 9, the housing that's affordable at or below 30%, that half of the people that live there are not at or below 30% income. I'd like to understand the demographics of that and the nature of that better. I mean, are these deeply subsidized units that have people that no longer qualify? Because like some programs, you can't kick them out. You can just charge them more rent. And so understanding if it's like a systemic failure or what is driving that would help give us better information to work with going forward. So I would be very interested in learning more about that and more information about that 12% that's at or below 30% on who those people are. Because if you're a college student and you're just temporarily below 30% of median income, it's no big deal. If that's your life, it's a whole different need and possible solutions. So it would help to have more information on what exactly are we talking about here for the needs and the people and what are they looking for. And then the graph that had the before 2010 and then 2011 and after, I mean, it is a pretty substantial drop off for all of the collar counties on what they're getting in the way of grants. And I think, I mean, Hennepin and Ramsey already were getting most of the money, but it's gotten more so since then. And there are things like Hastings took an old factory and turned it into a hotel and conference center and whatnot on the riverfront in downtown Hastings. And we participated in some cleanup things with TBRA, but we also participated in building parking structure so that they could deal with the additional density of users that come from having a hotel and conference center. And that also helps the other businesses that are on the downtown waterfront. That's not something that we would fund anymore. The parking structures are like evil. And those are the things that really can make a difference for some of the outer communities. It made a huge difference for Hastings. I mean, the confluence was a really big deal for them that they worked on for many, many years, and we were a partner, but we're not partners in those sorts of things anymore. And if the goal is just to do below 30% in mixed use business housing development, then it will be just a few inner suburbs and the core. But I think the whole purpose of this is to do sort of transformational development and helping cities be the best that they can be. And the example in Hastings is a really good example of something that made a huge difference to the community. And I think it was worthwhile to fund, and it's kind of sad that we don't participate in those sorts of things anymore.
Great. Thank you for the comments and also for the request for additional data. And I haven't talked to any of the staff about this, but that all sounds like very reasonable requests and something that we can actually generate. Did you have a comment, Director Barajas, or she's nodding?
Yep.
Yeah, I think those are excellent ways to help us advance this conversation to the next phases. So thank you. Further discussion? Yes, Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I really think that this has been a very important effort, so thank you for all your hard work. I think it gives me more information to know exactly what I was thinking when I came into this discussion, having been here in my 6th year and gone through a lot of these processes. I agree that it's a very good program and the projects that have been funded are very worthy. And yet I still see that, I think, at least this council, there will be many people coming, going after us, but, we're at a crossroads. Do we want to try to change the policy that we can control here to try to disperse the grants more geographically? And let me just do a pause here. Very proud to be a Hennepin County taxpayer and resident, but Hennepin County is huge. And so I've got caller cities, I will call them, that get wrapped into statistics for Hennepin County, whereby the northwest suburbs, which I represent, are very vibrant, huge job centers, economic corridor, a lot of growth coming its way, and they struggle to get these funds. So, I'm just representing my district. I appreciate in here too, some of the engagement and recommendations to maybe hold, was it countywide or even district-wide meetings with our cities, with our district rep. I'm assuming that's us. I would love to do that, as I mentioned at the last council meeting, just on the density changes for the suburban edge communities, and it's challenging. I can't get that yet in action. So I would welcome that. I've been asking for any sort of meeting that can take place in my district, and I'm sure all of you, it's not that I'm not in my district, but specifically the Met Council being a convener, to just sit around a room and just really hear about what our communities are telling us about the changes that we might not even be seeing in data yet. And I think anecdotes are very important to understand, well, why did that happen, or why isn't that happening, or what are your greatest challenges, or what are your greatest opportunities? And they're right. Again, in the report, the cost of land is just skyrocketing. If you thought it was bad before, exponentially so now. So I'm just trying to unravel this whole thing because, there's not enough money to go around. So let's all acknowledge that. $144 million of unfunded projects should be at least a first or second line when we testify at the legislature about what the Met Council is or isn't doing, or quite frankly, some of this data that we have for the communities that gave it their best shot, but just couldn't make the cut for all the reasons. But that there is an effort of those cities to do more, but there's a lack of funding through our work through the LCA program. I think that's important because there is, the notion that the suburban counties aren't doing enough. They don't want affordable housing. They don't want density. They don't want this, that, or the other thing. And I just don't see that as being true. I think it's not, certainly there are some council members and mayors that might feel that way, but there's just always been an effort to do more and create vibrant places to live. And I think we're just part of the Hennepin County that I represent, there are waves every 10 years. You see it certainly through the comprehensive planning process that we go through when we update that, where you see populations have moved out. And so that next ring now feels stressed because it's coming at them and they're having to grow up fast and they're having to get ready fast. And so I don't know how, if there's a way through LCA or just otherwise, we try to continue to help them, because that's where I see that there is stress in my communities who feel like they know they want to do more, but it's very difficult and change is coming fast at them. And so I think they, look to the Met Council for any help they can get. And, we can only do so much as well, but I would love to see a policy that somehow took things like that into account, because set aside the cities themselves, set aside the counties themselves, and set aside us. We are being challenged right now that our policies are concentrating 30% AMI or deeply affordable housing in the urban core and in the closely knit cities around the urban core. Well, when you look at the data, yes, there are cities having success, but they are, again, probably more mature cities that are getting that, and good for them, good for everybody who's getting it. But it just continues for me when I'm talking to my mayors and council members and managers, administrators, to go, you should try. I'm telling all of them, please join. Every time I'm out in the communities and I've got staff with them, like, you guys should apply, you should try, you should try. But it's hard to do that when they're already strapped for staff time, and I think sometimes they just give up or they have to put their time elsewhere, which really for me is just, I mean, it just, I think the unintended consequence in the whole situation we have out there is that it's removing cities from being able to participate more robustly. So, yeah, I don't know what changes we can make because, you know, and again, I agree, 30% AMI is incredibly important. And yet in my communities, 30% is included in many of the applications, but that above 30% is also, I think, easier for some of them to do when they're trying to do mixed classes, mixed affordability. And so I don't know, I feel frustrated because I've been doing this kind of stuff for 20-some years, and I just wish we could unlock and help the suburban communities get to where they want to go and help yet also to alleviate the pressures that they're feeling. And so in my early days at Plymouth, although we were still a very mature city at the time, you know, that wave was coming over our community, and it's just, I guess I'm just, you know, I don't know where we go. I would love to discuss ways where we could take a look at, you know, figuring out a way to help those collar cities, collar communities more so. I recognize the data is very solid on this, and yet I see a 17-member body that at the last council meeting, I'm like, well, we still have to vote for the good of the region, and in my words, I'll use the term myopic. And I don't know what, I have voted for the good of this region since I've had, well, before I've had an election certificate, when I was interning in Hennepin County for one of the commissioners. I mean, but there's a time when I want to step up and I want to really help my district out. And I would love, I have been asking, can we have a meeting out there on topic of transportation, topic of housing, LCA, Imagine 2050. And I struggle getting a meeting in my district. So I'm very fortunate that the mayors of a number of my cities meet every month. And I heard some feedback on some of the challenges they're going through. Dr. Carter is also attending those, which is great. And I think, you know, they welcome us there. They're so glad to have the Met Council showing up. We did a program on transportation and transit for them last year, or I should say this past cycle. And yet they feel very frustrated that they're just not gonna get what they need from Met Council in the end, and they're kind of on their own. And that part is hard, and I don't have anything to say here. Let's have a meeting here. Let's find some ways. What can we be doing? Because I haven't had that meeting, and I can't do it without staff. So I would love to be able to have these district meetings. I'm in year 5, wipe out COVID, even though we could have probably done them virtually, but I was probably too new my first year, 2 years here anyway, to know what I was talking about in a way. So I'm just telling you tonight, I appreciate all this. I appreciate the timeline. You know, at least the money is still flowing out there. But, you know, you have to live 100 years to see things happen in government. I understand that. And I just feel like I'm in the middle of this long haul, and I don't know. I'm just frustrated. I'm very grateful for what everyone is doing. I know everyone here is an expert, but for some of us who represent communities that are just, you know, many dots disconnected from what we're trying to do here, it's frustrating. And let me just say too, it's really hinged on what we agree to be our priorities at the Met Council, which I have solidly been behind. But we also have to recognize there are communities out there that are going through their own different set of challenges with different people coming and going out of their communities where they might not sync up perfectly with ours, because this is a big region. And I just wish we could have some sub-regional policies whereby we're helping them to eventually get to where we want them to go, but we're not leaving them on their own to do it. And so if we can figure something out, that'd be great. But it feels almost like cookie cutter if you don't specifically adopt what we've adopted. And trust me, we are a very mature organization, and a lot of the cities are very mature, and we're aligned. But some of these other communities, they want to get there, but it's just hard for them. So I'm frustrated, and I just have to say all this, and I'll probably be frustrated for a good long time at Met Council and with my appreciation for what we're doing here. It's hard work, but somebody's got to convince me that there must be something that we can be doing to help some of these communities that just aren't at the table.
Thank you, Councilmember. Did you want to say something, Ellen?
Thank you, Committee Chair and Council Member. I would just say that you're right, and there are some things. If you look at the changes, it will take you all deciding to make the change. There are different approaches. There's, I'd say, micro and macro changes. Some are more tweaks. Some, I think, will address some of the leveling the playing field. But the bigger issues are really the policy changes that, as we say, you all have to wrestle with.
Thank you. I'm going to make a quick comment, then I'll recognize it. Please, Councilmember Wolf, thank you. And just kind of based on what Councilmember Johnson was saying, and that kind of falls into what the stakeholder engagement might look like, right, through 2025. I know that Director Barajas has been considering what that 2025 work could look like. I know that she's not prepared to discuss it tonight, and that's just fine, but that's a robust year of work. I mean, things will have happened, the adoption of the Imagine 2050 and things like that can inform the work. But really the word, listening to you, Councilmember Johnson, and to others, and I've never really thought of it this way before tonight, so I just want to be really clear. This is like right off the top of my head kind of thinking, but I'm a Minneapolis guy, and I was, served on the Minneapolis City Council, and, have been Met Council adjacent for a long time. But really what I see, and again, this is semi-informed and really raw thinking, but in some cities, like Minneapolis, which is a big city with resources, but there's like in the development community, there's a culture of using these funds, right? So there's a familiarity with them. There's an understanding at both the development, with developers and staff, how you generate an application. And it's making me think, are there things we can do to help build, to help transport that culture of using these funds into other communities? And again, that's just really raw thinking, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like there might be something there. Thanks. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and that actually sort of segues right into what I was going to say. Because we have parts of the region where there's a real partnership between the council and city governments, and Minneapolis is a good example of that, St. Paul as well. In the Livable Communities program, we used to have that in many of the suburbs. Burnsville, Apple Valley, Lakeville, Hastings, all used to be frequent applicants and successful applicants. When I was on the Lakeville City Council, we got a number of Livable Communities grants for affordable housing projects, and one was to clean up the old dump in downtown Lakeville so we could put an affordable housing project on top. Those communities have all stopped applying. And in general, it feels like in the outer parts of the region, specifically all across the South Metro, there's less and less of a partnership and a feeling of shared goals between the council and local governments. Because, I mean, this is, God, my fourth time through the hamster wheel of comprehensive planning. Sure. And it's more and more about council goals and what cities need to do to be furthering council goals. But for a lot of the edge communities, there isn't anything other than sewers that comes from the council or from the state for that matter, because LGA went away from most suburban communities in 2002, and there is not a MnDOT investment in the outer suburbs. I mean, if you look at the highway map between Highway 13 and Burnsville and Highway 19 going to Northfield, there are no east-west state highways. None. Yet, we're saying, okay, you got to do all this development of certain kinds and whatnot, and there's essentially no livable communities grants going to Dakota or Scott County anymore. And I'm not saying that I want money for my people. That's not it at all. I'm just giving those examples of things that I know where the system seems to be breaking down, where we're not a partner anymore. Because if everything has to be done locally, except that you have to do council goals, what's the point? What is the value that we're adding to those communities? We're just another layer of bureaucracy that's not really being a partner. And my goal for livable communities is to get back to being a partner like we were in the 2000s and before with those communities. If we don't, well, okay, then we can continue what we're doing, and they won't be real interested in what our priorities are because we're not a partner. But I think I really look forward to having a robust discussion on, is that where we want to go?
Thank you, Councilmember. Thanks. Further discussion on this from Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is more of a, a level up. So I think, I've learned quickly that, well, let me just say, Mr. Chair, I love being on this committee because we do dig in, and you help us facilitate really good discussions here, and we have all the experts in the room, and it's very helpful. I think what I struggle with, and maybe this is part of what we're hearing coming out of the Imagine 2050 process as we move forward, is just we meet in our subcommittees. And again, I said this at the council meeting, but I think it bears repeating. We're not committees of the whole in everything we do, like maybe the counties are and the cities. So it is harder for the other voting members of the body, unless we're all watching all of each other's videos of the meetings we can't go to, which is not happening in my world. It's just hard by the time it rolls up, if there are still some differing viewpoints, for everybody to figure out where in the weeds we started and what are these nuggets that are driving this. And if it's not in their community and they're not seeing it on a regular basis, it's just, I just feel like that's where it just rolls up, and well, we still got to do what the bigger, what we've been doing, or what the bigger goals are, what the counties want, or Minnesota Housing wants, which, by the way, they're all great. Love Minnesota Housing, love, love, love. I will just say, though, when they went to 30% AMI and counties and cities, big cities went to 30% AMI, that was a game changer. It was a game changer for people who needed 30% AMI. It was also a game changer that, for me, I believe there was a chill put on anything if you were going to go over 30% AMI, because I've seen it in at least one of my communities. And so here we are. I don't know. It's just, I don't know. Maybe it just is what it is, and it's the normal. And we hope that more cities everywhere will be more successful, and yet participation is going to tell us if we're being successful or not. The money will go to worthy projects, no matter what. But I heard a few years ago, with it falling off after COVID, we really needed to work to get these cities back on, and I think there's been a great effort to do that. But if we don't change something, I don't think we will have success in some of the areas that maybe you're hearing from some of us on the council.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on the report? All right, seeing none again, thanks very much, Ellen, Mary Kay, for the work on this. It was very helpful having you engage us in this way. I look forward to what not just the 2025 FDP is, but what the 2025 process might be to engage. And so there's more to come. Thanks again. And I want to thank not just the staff, Sarah, and everyone that's here, but the committee members as well. We approached this in kind of a different way. It was more workshop-y and direct engagement with our consultants, and I really liked that. So I would be, willing to. I'd like to see. So that's nice to see nods, and maybe that's something that we can continue to do as we go forward in this committee. I found it very helpful. Cool. All right, we will move on the agenda then. Please, we will move on to our final information item. It's the Imagine 2050 Regional Park and Trails Policy Plan with the public comment summary and next steps. And I think we have Emmett Mullen and Colin Kelly here to present. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair and council members. I am Colin Kelly, Planning Analyst, and I'm joined by Emmett Mullen, Council Parks Manager. Today, the two of us will be sharing a high-level summary of the public comment process, including who commented, how they commented, and most importantly, what they said. I'll be covering the first several slides, and then I'll pass it over to Emmett, who will cover several examples of how comments received have directly impacted the draft Parks Policy Plan. Like each of the council's policy plans, public comments on the Regional Parks and Trails Policy Plan, considered a chapter of Imagine 2050, were accepted from August 15th to October 7th. These comments were accepted in multiple forms, including online, email, hard copy mail, and in person, including both art and policy events and at a formal public hearing right here. Taking all policy plans into consideration, more than 1,200 comments were received from about 500 organizations and individuals. Council Parks and Trails staff also received comments on the draft Parks and Trails Planning Handbook until late last month. This handbook is intended to directly relate to the Parks Policy Plan and provide space for the detailed guidance and procedures that are more closely assigned with the implementation of policies and actions rather than the policies themselves. Think local planning handbook, but focused on the regional parks and trails system. I mentioned art and policy on the last slide. As a quick reminder to council members, this was and is an initiative to incorporate art into the planning process to increase visibility and accessibility of Imagine 2050 and the public comment period. Council staff have collaborated with 4 visual artists to create designs of each policy area, including land use, transportation, water, parks and trails, and housing. Council staff also worked with 9 engagement artists to attend events across the region to attract visitors and gather comments. Some of the art projects included custom flags, like you see behind you, murals, sound gardens, and projection art. So, what have we heard? Well, I'll be honest with you, we've heard quite a bit. And while we don't have the time to discuss all of the unique comments received during the public comment period, we want to provide you with a high-level summary of the themes and share a number of specific examples today. Council staff are actively considering each and every one of the comments received, and we'll be sharing all of our responses within the next month or so as the policy plan is considered for adoption as a part of Imagine 2050. Let's start with who we heard from. We heard from 14 agencies and local government units, including the National Park Service, 9 out of 10 regional park implementing agencies, and the cities of Richfield, Hugo, Brooklyn Park, and Lakeville. There is an asterisk after implementing agencies. That's because staff wanted to point out that even if we didn't hear from all 10 agencies during the public comment period, all 10 agencies were and are directly involved in the update to the Regional Parks Policy Plan going all the way back to the middle of 2022, if not before. And of course, they all had an opportunity to review and comment on the 60% draft plan that we provided earlier this year. They have been deeply involved in this process and will continue to be. We also heard from the general public, the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, and you when we shared the public comment draft back in early August. How did folks comment? As I mentioned previously, we received comments via a number of different channels, including the online engagement tool, email, and the public hearing. From a numbers perspective, we received about 105 parks or trails related comments and held over 20 art and policy engagement events, which led to 232 flags sewn, 171 postcard submissions, 141 mural blocks painted, and 16 Indigenous youth manifestos for the future. Now that you heard a bit about who commented and how they commented, I'd like to share the first 2 parts of what we heard. Parts 1 and 2 are high-level themes and specific examples of what we've heard during the public comment period, starting here with key themes. Overall, we heard that we ought to center the council's role in the regional parks and trails system at the policy level. Regarding the system plan.
Mr. Kelly, I'm sorry to interrupt, and we've all been so polite to not interrupt the presenters today, but I just need to better understand that. So is there a sense that that's not what we're doing now, or what does that mean? I guess I don't quite understand what that means.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to start into that, and perhaps I could continue.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So I think in some spaces within the policy plan or the planning handbook, both drafts at this point, there's some spaces where additional guidance or procedure may be provided. In some places, quite a bit of detail. So we're trying to be thoughtful about what sits within the policy plan and what sits within the planning handbook, for example. And so I think there's a desire to keep what's in the policy plan at a higher level versus the additional detail that might be provided in other documents.
That makes sense.
The only other thing I would add, Mr. Chair and council members, is the council's role with the regional parks and trail system is really one of support. We aren't involved so much in the direct provision of outdoor recreation. That's nothing new to you, but we just want to be really clear, and we want our plan to reflect that.
Got it. Thank you. Please, Mr. Kelly.
Sounds good. So next up, regarding the system plan, there were recommendations to further refine the cultural landscape classification, varied suggestions on developing an open space or natural systems classification, and an interest in clarifying regionally significant bridging facilities. Regarding recreation facilities and programming, comments suggested assessing the balance between being a regional system and providing amenities for underserved communities. Regarding finance, some commenters asked, how can the council and state increase financial support for the regional system as demand for parks and trails increases? Moving into part 2 of What Did We Hear, I'll provide a snapshot of comments across the policy plan and at least a couple that relate to the planning handbook as well. Rather than read each of the following 29 bullet points on this and the next 2 slides, I'll just give voice to one from each section here, and of course, encourage you all to read the remainder when you're able. Overall, we heard there is continued uncertainty around the authority and jurisdiction of the planning handbook. Related to the overview, a member of the public said, your objectives are strong and comprehensive. Be sure to include the aging population in your work. As for the system plan, we heard that we should upgrade data sampling in the visitor studies so that data is representative at the individual park and trail unit level. With regard to natural systems and its action associated with locating or siting and acquisition, we heard someone say that they'd love to see a large amount of expansion to the regional trail system. In climate resilience, we heard that Met Council should be a leader in this area and provide steps for achieving goals along with working with implementing agencies. In planning, we heard a request that all future revisions to the planning handbook be required to obtain approval by the Met Council. And in system protection, we heard from the National Park Service that the 2050 policy plan should prioritize visual protections to maintain the region's aesthetic and scenic qualities, citing the importance of preserving the visual integrity and scenic vistas of the Mississippi River corridor. Speaking of the National Park Service, Councilmember Vento spoke to the importance of maintaining and strengthening the relationship between the National Park Service and the Council, particularly the Regional Parks and Trails System, during the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission meeting on November 7th. Thank you for that comment, Councilmember. In recreation facilities and programming, we heard that uses should be consistent with the state park system if we're going to make the comparison relevant in the eyes of legislators. In finance, we heard that the council should consider establishing a dedicated operations and maintenance fund, particularly for long-term maintenance after restoration. And finally, the work plan. We heard from the American Indian Advisory Council, who said that the council ought to develop a training program for staff from parks implementing agencies about indigenous management practices. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Emmett to share some of the proposed plan modifications.
Thanks, Mr. Mullen.
Thanks, Chair and council members and Colin. I now want to just jump into a few of the comments and our responses. So Section 2 is the system plan. And public comments in this section touched on clarifying the cultural landscape subclassification. We heard mainly from implementing agencies on this topic, and their comments ranged from broad support of the cultural landscape subclassification to the need for further refinement. No one disagrees with the need for it, but there's just a little bit of degrees of comfort. At MPOSC this past, or I guess it was November 7th, Chair Uruso was wondering, are there other examples of cultural landscape classifications? And I think there are, but it is relatively new for the regional system, so it feels new to us. To address comments, park staff proposed the following refinements. The first proposal is to modify the policy plan classification description for cultural landscapes, clarifying that therefore lands with significant cultural value to American Indian tribes and other cultural organizations and communities. So it's broader than just American Indian tribes. Second, council park staffs proposed to continue to refine the subclassification with American Indian tribes and other cultural communities and partners during plan implementation. So the idea that we are going to establish this, that's the recommendation from the current plan. And the idea that also we have refinement work to do in plan implementation.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you. Briefly, do we have a definition around cultural communities?
Mr. Chair and council member, I think it's a fairly broad definition. I don't have it at my fingertips, but I could get that to you in the committee.
Sure, that'd be great. Just generally as we talk about expanding, and I just would like to know what that means because it could mean a lot of things. So thank you.
Sure.
Great question. And Mr. Mullen?
Great. I think I'm on the next slide. The next one, I jump now to the recreation facilities and programming section. We heard a range of comments, particularly from implementing agencies on this topic, including, this is once again, Councilmember Lilligren, to accurately reflect the council role, to reduce the content, it's a long plan, and to consider a standalone action on ineligible activities. To address these comments, council park staff proposed the following refinements. The first proposal is to modify language to exactly what Colin and I were saying earlier around accurately reflecting the council role, which is really around that we support the system rather than we're in the frontline development or delivery of recreation services. The second proposal is to move the desired outcome examples, which were a big part of Section 7, and supporting quotes to the planning handbook. The planning handbook is the complementary procedural document that's like the local planning handbook. Lastly, the third proposal is to create a new Action 6 within this section of the plan to house the content for ineligible activities and facilities. So nothing new, but just centralize it in an independent action. Section 8, finance. This was an area where we received, as you may guess, a lot of comments. There were two general themes. The first was interesting because I think it was something that maybe we weren't clear enough, but there were concerns expressed that council staff was moving finance policies away from collaboration and toward pure management. And I just want to reinforce this. This sentiment was not our intent. It was, in fact, the opposite of that. There was a concerted effort to centralize the council or the chapter into the upfront section, which was the statutory requirements, which we don't have discretion over, and then the areas where the council does have discretion. To remedy this misunderstanding, council staff recommended clarifying the language in the policy to collaborate with a range of partners. So we made that suggestion or that change. Second, a number of commenters expressed concerns about how state and regional funding are not keeping up with the growing needs. This theme was the predominant flavor of comment that we that we heard. Staff recommends raising up 4 finance-related items in the 4-year work plan. That's section 9, the last section of the plan, and include these, just the clarifying, and we concentrated them into the finance section of the work plan, into a recommendation for a system-wide asset preservation plan. That was the first one, pursuing this concept called PAYGO, which is a tool for better or leveraging council funds. The third one was around exploring changing and possibly reducing local match requirements. And the fourth one was a recommendation to continue the strategic funding discussion that we initiated with agencies during the planning process. So that was a really successful work group, and honestly, we ran out of time and we're just committed to continuing that into implementation. Now this is another slide on the work plan. There were another comments around how priorities were, okay, now we're on to the work plan. How was the work plan, how were items identified and prioritized, I'm sorry. And we wanted to be clear that the items in the work plan were identified through the engagement process. We heard them from regional park implementing agencies, council members, MPOS commissioners, and other stakeholders. Many of the topics, as I said, taken up during planning proved too large or complex to finish. So we just said, let's continue that and let's identify those items in the work plan. Finally, there was interest expressed in a public commitment to take up climate change in the work plan. This was not a new idea, that was always the intent, that we continue talking about climate change into implementation, but we specifically called it out in the work plan around adaptation and mitigation next steps during implementation. We're getting there. Slide 13. So the other point I wanted to make on the work plan was around comments from the American Indian Advisory Council, as well as others working in this culture space. So we captured many of these items in section 9, and actually 4 items, the commitments that were shared with by the American Indian Advisory Council. The first was developing cultural resources inventory requirement for long-range planning. This is akin to the natural resources inventory requirement that we have. We have no interest in duplicating state and federal law in this part, but we made a run at identifying this and including it in the plan, but it soon became clear that we needed more time to figure it out with partners. So that will happen in implementation. We also made a public commitment here, I think it's number 7 there, continue to develop and refine the cultural landscape classification, as we said. Thirdly, develop an inventory of and guidelines for harvestable fruits, mushrooms, and edible plants. That was a big interest of the American Indian Advisory Council. And it's also an interest of a lot of communities. The Southeast Asian communities, Senator Fa recently held a public hearing on this and expressed an interest in working with the regional park system and others. Finally, we wanted to just publicly state a broader council effort to develop a training program for council and regional park implementing agency staff about indigenous land practices and other important topics. A lot of us have attended that state tribal relations training. That's excellent, and we want to do something maybe a little bit more customized to the council work and implementing agency work. So now what? Next steps. The big message here is we are getting there. We are going through all the public comments. It's very detailed work, but we are making tremendous progress. We're actively processing comments, developing responses, and we are refining the policy plan and the planning handbook. We are responsive. So when the council considers adoption of Vision 2050, including the Regional Parks and Trails Planning Handbook, we're looking that will happen sometime in mid-February. For your information, this is the land use and housing bus. This is just another way to basically show you our timeline. We're just past the public comment period. We're working on revisions, and we're really looking forward to the first quarter in 2025. Post-adoption, we look forward to working with you. We'll be back with all these work plan items as we continue to move them forward. So thank you for your patience with that presentation. We are now at the point of asking for your questions or your feedback.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for the report. Thanks for your work on this. It's interesting to look at the timeline and see, wow, we actually have moved along this line, right? Discussion, Councilmember Dolkar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of general comments, and then I have a request. So my first general comment is, I think I am surprised. This is my first regional development guide, not unlike Councilmember Wolf. So I think I'm generally surprised at how often the comments are from agencies and government employees or partners and not necessarily from public. This is my first time doing this, and I'm used to other public comments that I've done with rulemaking, where I'm used to like general public and community-based organizations really actively participating. So I think it's just a general comment. And then the second part I was going to say is, I think in one of your, the second last slide, it said plan, and I think you meant plants.
We did mean plants,
Yeah.
excuse me.
But I would say, I think I really appreciate it because that came up, I think, in the American Indian Council Advisory Committee meeting. And I do think there are, and I've actually seen people pick, I don't even recognize them, like people pick plants in parks when I've gone for walks, and people actually do eat them, which I think I really appreciated. So thank you for that work. And then the third thing that I do want to acknowledge is I think almost consistently, like I went through every one of the comments that got submitted, which wasn't a lot, so I do encourage reading all the comments, or at least the summary that you all provided. The acknowledgement on financing, I think consistently it came up, the need for more funding and the council's role in it. And I think the change you offered is very smart. It doesn't necessarily say we will solve for all the funding that is required, but it does say we will partner, and I think it is responsibility of everyone. So just acknowledging the pains that every implementing agencies that you probably hear more from, just requirement for funding. The request I have is, there was a public comment by somebody, it looks anonymous, doesn't have a name, but that person did put in a comment about accessing parks. And sometimes I do feel
About
like
what?
parks, like being able to go to parks.
Oh, got it.
And access to parks.
Got it.
But more in like, can I go to park, but more in like, how do I get there, like physically get there? And sometimes I do think, as I've sit on council between this committee and transportation, like our policies don't always talk to each other. And like the perfect example I keep always bringing up is our desire for density and density versus transportation funding and projects that go on. I've said it over and over again in transportation, like you can't, if you wait for density to come before you build a transit line, density may never come. Sometimes density follows the transit line, so it's always a conflicting. But this person commented on like, how do I even get to the park?
Yeah.
And given that Met Council is the largest transit providers, the next time you present this to the entire council, whenever that is, I forgot the date, I do think that comment should be brought up, because if Metro Transit, this should be something Metro Transit should think about it. And I know Network Now is now publicly out there for public comments, but I don't think in the Network Now, I saw how that relates back to like the fact that we are a regional parks provider and how any of our parks are accessible by public transit. They should at least be a one bus stop. And I don't think I've seen it. And I was trying to think in my head if there was any park that had a bus stop right in front of it, and I could not. But I haven't made it to all the parks either. So that's my request to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmembers. Councilmember Bento is requesting the floor. And it looks like you're kind of packing up to go, so maybe I'll go to you, Councilmember Bento, before any kind of response from Mr.
I just want to thank you for that remark, Councilmember Dolkar. The transportation connection is an issue that's been raised a number of times in MPOSC meetings, and in particular, we have one MPOSC member who's really good at reminding us of the importance of this, and we have, in some cases, it's just simply changing a bus stop by not a significant amount of space to make that park more accessible, or moving it around to a different spot rather than where there's no entrance. People shouldn't have to get off and then walk a great distance in order to get into that park. So that's an issue that's been raised, and since I serve on Transportation Committee as well, I will do what I can to plug that issue in there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Wolf's requesting the floor. Did you guys want to respond, or can I keep moving through? All right, keep moving.
I think that's best. I
Thanks.
get it.
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's probably a lot of extra in there that we could clean out. I talked to you earlier on the phone about fluff.
Yeah.
I support the comments about that the program guide should also go through MPOSC and the council for approval. It's not just a sideways get around the policy process. I support the whole foraging thing, but we're going to need to monitor it to make sure that if we let people know where the foraging is, that people don't come and abuse it. When it's not used very much, you get the hardcore people who know don't pick it all because it won't grow back if you pick it all. But if it turns into, people are destroying the ecosystem because they're abusing the foraging, that would be problematic. I don't support using regional park money for the I can't remember what it's called, the open space, natural, whatever thing.
Yeah.
Because we don't have enough money for what we're already doing, so biting off more things doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. And I look forward to more discussion about the cultural landscape stuff. There's a lot of great places for that, like Pilot Knob in Mendota Heights is a part that's not currently in the regional park system, but probably should be under that classification. But there's a lot of other places that people want kept quiet because they find vulnerability in having those locations of the cultural landscape stuff known. And that seems to be sort of in conflict with the whole idea of public access. So I'd like to get some more information about how that nuance gets worked out, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm still frustrated about the part where it goes about redlining and whatnot in Minneapolis, because that occurred before the regional park system even existed and was illegal by the time it became the regional park system. but we have tremendous access to waterfront areas in Minneapolis and St. Paul because of the way they did their parks before the regional park system came in. Yeah, I'm sure people around Lake Harriet and Bedé-Makaska and Lake of the Isles wanted to keep all of the poor people out, regardless of what color they were. But we now all have very good access. And framing it the way it is in the plan gives sort of a real negative take on something that's a great asset to the community. And I don't see why we want to flog that particular item.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. So if there's no other, so my kind of two comments here are, well, I would just slightly push back on the idea that there's great access for everyone to water in the city of Minneapolis. And in the ward I represented for my 3 terms, there was no water. And we had people with very limited transportation options. So it's there, I agree with you, but I don't want to frame it as everyone in Minneapolis has access to waterfront. So, okay, yeah, Councilmember Wolf.
Mr. Chair, that's not what I was saying at all.
Okay.
I was talking on a regional
Sure.
level. When you look at our region compared to other places
Right.
where people own all of the riverfront
Sure.
and you can't
Oh, I
get
see what you're
there,
saying, sure.
or all of the lakefront and you can't get there except for maybe a boat landing or a little beach.
Right,
We as a region have tremendous access.
sure. We have a lot of water. too.
We have a lot of water, but we also have tremendous access to get there. That doesn't mean everybody has the means,
Okay,
you know,
cool.
I mean.
Great, thanks for that
But
clarification.
that's what I meant.
We used to talk about the city of lakes, of course. Like, I don't got no lakes in my ward, so, okay. I mean, we're not part of the city. All right, so the 2 things. I really want to lift up what Councilmember Johnson said about cultural communities and being a little more specific. I way prefer the term cultural communities than the cultural organizations and communities, because then it's a whole nother kind of complicated stratum to define. And I would expect that organized cultural communities, and it could be organized in the loosest term, you know, that I self-identify and live as a cultural community, have some kind of organization. But I would benefit from a little bit more definition around what a cultural community means. And it's very parallel to the work I do in my daily life, and we're often, we have this conversation all the time, what does this even mean? What does community even mean? But also we partner with other cultural communities, and whether that's, you know, the Norway House or American Swedish Institute, or whether it's Juxtaposition Arts or, you know, others. So it'd be helpful to have a little definition around that. And the other one has to do, and this was, I suppose, in the nature of a surprise, but the PAYGO conversation. And this is, I think, maybe the first time I heard of it, or maybe it just didn't register for it. It was on slide 11.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if the idea is that we would be the sort of financiers of a PAYGO project, or if the expectation is the implementing agencies would structure their projects as PAYGO. And, okay, so someone has I can't tell if it's Lisa or if it's Emmett.
I can do that.
Yeah,
Mr.
thanks.
Chair, is a good question. Right now, under Minnesota statutes, the council can only provide funding through bonding,
Okay,
through issuing regional bonds, and then using interest earnings related to those bonds. We don't, as you may recall, we don't often issue regional bonds or in small amounts, and it's a massive undertaking, staff time, going to the meetings, doing all the things to manage a small amount of bonds that we are paying off in a very short time frame. So for the amount of lift and ask, we're like,
Sure.
well, we could just use the money that we're already using to pay the bonds to just pay directly rather than going through
Okay.
this hoopla for it.
So-
But we need a legislative authority
Okay.
to just use our levy rather than to go through bonds, to use our levy to pay the bonds. It's kind of a
cool.
Yeah,
Thank you.
simplified process.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. And so we would become sort of a financer of PAYGO projects, or maybe that's not the right word to use.
I would maybe clarify that the council would just would have the opportunity to change the way it matches regional
Okay,
funds.
okay.
There you go. Rather than offering bonds only as a match,
Okay.
to offer other sources of
Well,
funding.
no, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting.
Just on
Yeah,
that very
Councilmember
point.
Johnson.
And
Lisa, do you know if the park implementing agencies, do they do legislative work to try to get a legislative change, or are they looking at us to do that? Because I sat in on our legislative meeting recently, and it's just not always that easy for us to just put ideas out there, but I think it's a good one to pursue
Agreed.
and learn more about. So are they pursuing that, or is it just kind of a hope and a dream?
Mr. Chair, council members, it actually is one that the council has issued because it's specifically about the council's funding and how we might use our own funds. And we have introduced that legislation in the past. It had an author in the last biennium, and we're looking to continue that and hopefully get some movement around that at some point. As you know, legislation often takes years to get through the approval process. But when we have presented that to legislators in previous biennium, we did not have any pushback on it. People are like, yeah, that makes sense. It just doesn't kind of get the pickup to get added to someone's bill somewhere. So hopefully we'll get a year in there.
Appreciate that, thank you.
Cool, thanks, Councilmember Johnson. And I'm guessing, what you're leaning toward is all 10 implementing agencies in my council holding hands together. And to the legislator would be a very powerful thing.
It would be, I think,
Yeah.
capture a lot of legislators in that
Yeah,
big of a
it's
swath.
pretty much that's everybody, right? Cool.
The agencies have supported that in the past and have spoken on behalf of that legislation when we've had it.
Cool. Anything else, committee members? If not, Emmett and Colin, thanks so much for your work and for this. Look forward to moving it along. Do you need anything else from us? Are you getting what you need?
This was great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'll be in touch.
Cool.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. We come to the end of our agenda. Lisa, anything else? Michelle, anything? All right, seeing no further business before this committee, we're adjourned.